Hey, happy Thursday morning, everyone. Hope you've had a great week. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we will be having Preterist Pilgrim Weekend, July 12th through 14th, Ardmore Convention Center. Do not miss this. It's going to be great. Well, oh, and by the way, don't forget that tomorrow, Friday, I will be continuing my review and response to Mr. Joel Richardson's book, Mystery Babylon, Unlocking the Bible's Greatest Prophetic Mystery. Mr. Richardson believes that Babylon is the Islamic movement. I believe that is an egregious and anachronistic application of what the book of Revelation is all about. I believe it completely misses the point, and I'll be sharing with you just some. You know, I don't have time to go through every single error that I believe that Mr. Richardson commits and teaches in this book. But don't forget, be with me tomorrow. Well, we're looking at the resurrection of 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and how it is directly parallel with Paul's discussion of the adoption, the redemption of the body, in Romans chapter 8. This is conceded by virtually all scholars. The tragedy of it is, it seems to me, is that the scholars, number one, they overlook the immediate context. One of the greatest errors that commentators make when they approach Romans chapter 8, and I've gone over this before, so I won't belabor the point, but when Paul said, I reckon that the suffering of this present time is not worthy to be compared with the glory that is about to be revealed. Preacher after preacher, commentary after commentator say, well, you know, the suffering of the present time is the human affliction. It is mankind suffering in a cursed world, laboring under the burden of sin. And one of these days, at the end of time, our cursed body, our cursed existence will be free, and we'll have a physical, literal new heaven, new earth. Folks, that is the farthest thing, I hope you've seen so far, from what Paul is talking about. The suffering that Paul was talking about was the suffering for the cause of Christ that he and his audience was undergoing 2,000 years ago. Look at Romans 8:17. They were enduring the sufferings of Christ. That's an eschatological reference to the last days suffering to fill up the measure of suffering, the measure of sin on the part of the persecutors, to bring in the day of the Lord in judgment of the persecutors, in vindication of their suffering. This is a favorite theme of mine, I must confess. But the point of fact is, when we ignore that proper context, and we say, well, Paul's just talking about, you know, I got bad feet. I've got two bad shoulders, and I'm getting old. Look at my hair, for crying out loud. It's not what it used to be. That's not the suffering Paul had in mind. Okay, enough on that. Paul says in Romans chapter 8 that the whole creation groans in birth pains until now. It is simply wrong, unless we have overwhelming contextual reason to do so, to extrapolate that groaning of Paul's then present time for 2,000 years. Furthermore, as I shared with you in the last video, boy, this is such good stuff. Paul is drawing directly on an extremely well-known, well-accepted, and biblical motif, and that is the birth pains of Messiah. Very quickly, in the Jewish eschatological narrative, in the timeline, the Jews believed, and by the way, in my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, I delineate this timeline. I prove this timeline is exactly and precisely the timeline that Jesus and the New Testament writers followed. They agreed with that Jewish timeline and the order of occurrence. So in the Jewish narrative of the timeline, they believed Elijah would come in the last days, and he would set right matters of the heart. He would judge in matters of marriage. Well, that's exactly what we see John the Baptizer doing. Then you would have a great apostasy. Well, you ought to consider carefully Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 12, 43 to 45, where he said that his generation was the worst generation of Israel ever. That's not a great apostasy? You see, there are two elements of the great apostasy. I won't go into that here. Number 3, you have the Great Tribulation. Now again, some rabbis kind of flip that narrative and say, well, you have the Great Tribulation, and because of the tribulation, you'd have the apostasy. That seems to be what Jesus teaches in Matthew chapter 24. You'd have the false prophets, the false teachers, and the persecution, and as a result, the falling away of believers. So there's two aspects. Now, this Great Tribulation is known as, in the Jewish narrative, as the birth pains of Messiah. The birth pangs of Messiah in Jewish eschatology, in Old Testament eschatology, in the Old Testament predictions of the last days, we find the prophecy, the Great Tribulation, and the resurrection, the new creation, the kingdom, inextricably bound together. Let me share one. It's a fantastic text. For years and years, I ignored the power of this text. That was my own ignorance at work. Jeremiah chapter 30. Now keep in mind, the historical context is the 10 northern tribes have already been carried off into Assyrian captivity. Judah is about to be carried off into Babylonian captivity. So you're about to see the dissolution of the nation of Israel. But watch what the Lord promised. Jeremiah chapter 30. For behold, the days are coming. You know, scholars recognize that this phraseology, the days are coming, can refer to one of two different things. Number one, this is going to happen later, not necessarily eschatological. Secondly, it is an eschatological introductory phrase to speak of the last days. That's what it has to be in this text. Okay, the days are coming, says the Lord. Now watch, catch the power of this, that I will bring back from captivity my people Israel and Judah, says the Lord, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it. Folks, this is messianic prophecy, pardon me, because in messianic prophecy, all 12 tribes would be reunited. This is Ezekiel chapter 37, and the parable of two sticks being bound back together. What is that prophecy? What is the prophecy of the valley of dry bones? This is the whole house of Israel standing once again, being restored once again unto Messiah. Oh, but it's not only, that being restored unto Messiah is the kingdom. Watch this now. Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 5. Now remember, this is in the day of the restoration of all 12 tribes. This is Romans 11, 25 to 27. I have heard a voice of trembling, of fear and not of peace. Ask now and see whether a man is ever in labor with a child. Has a man ever been pregnant? Why then do I see every man with his hands on his loins like a woman in labor, and all faces turn pale? Alas, for that day. What day? The day of the restoration of Israel. But wait a minute. The day of the restoration of Israel is the kingdom, as we're going to see. Folks, the restoration, the day of the restoration of the kingdom is the resurrection. Kingdom and resurrection go together. You can't divide them. You can't separate them. You can't divorce them. That day is great, so that none is like it. It is the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. Wait a minute. You got the Great Tribulation, but Israel saved out of it? Well, not all of them. The remnant of all of them. And we find that down in verse 11, I think it is. But watch this. It shall come to pass in that day. In what day? Judah and Israel restored, the Great Tribulation. It shall come to pass in that day, says the Lord, I will break his yoke. That's the enemy of God's people. Burst your bonds. Foreigners shall no more enslave you. For they shall, watch this, catch the power, they shall serve the Lord their God and David their king. This is messianic. This is kingdom prophecy. But what comes first? The Great Tribulation. Listen, I want you absolutely got to catch this. There is an unbreakable bond, an inseparable connection between the Great Tribulation, the birth pangs of Messiah of Romans chapter 8, and the resurrection. I mean, after all, that's what Paul's talking about, isn't it? The whole creation groans in birth pains until now. But his now was going to give way to what? The glory that was about to be revealed. Resurrection. The revealing of the sons of God. The kingdom. And thus, here is Jeremiah, restoration of all Israel, the Great Tribulation, and the kingdom. Oh, and by the way, in chapter 31, at that same time, Jeremiah 31, 1 and 2, what would happen? I give a new covenant to the whole house of Israel. The Great Tribulation, the restoration of Israel, that is, the righteous remnant. So, the restoration of Israel, the restoration, that is, the salvation of the righteous remnant, the Great Tribulation, the establishment of the kingdom, the establishment of the new covenant, all go together. And Paul said he was living in the time of the birth pangs. Oh, and Jesus was emphatic on this, and we will pick this idea, this motif, and this theme of the Great Tribulation, the kingdom, and the resurrection. We'll pick this up next Monday. You don't want to miss this. Anytime that we admit, as amillennialists and postmillennialists do, anytime we admit that the Great Tribulation was in the first century, we have thereby admitted the resurrection was in the first century. Yeah, this is important stuff. Okay, go to my website, order my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, where you see all of this and a whole lot more developed. Be sure to let me know that you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll pay your shipping. All right, hey, thank you for joining me. I'll see you in the morning as we continue our review of Joel Richardson's book, Mystery Babylon. See you on the flip side.